Hey brewers, looking to speed up your brews? Today I'm going to help you shave off as much as 3 hours from your process. So let's go. By making some simple adjustments to your process and planning ahead, you can really boil down your brews into 3 to 4 hours for an all grain batch. Now the last tip I'm going to give you is going to take off an extra 30 to 40 minutes, so make sure to check that out. We're going to start by freeing up 45 minutes right off the bat. And here it is. Sparging is not required. In my experience, sparging generally gives me about 3 to 5% additional gravity points. So lately I've been finding myself asking, why am I even bothering with this? Why not just build in 3 to 5% extra gravity points into the grain bill and forego the sparge altogether? You might be thinking, yeah, but what if the quality of the beer suffers because we're not doing a sparge? Well, interestingly, Brewlosophy found that no sparge beers actually had more malt flavor. So even if you're not looking to save time on your brew, this might be worth considering. Now, this whole idea is not a new one. I suspect a lot of brewers haven't tried it because they're so locked into their process that they don't want to mess with it. They just want to keep sparging, doing things as they do today. But if you're here, you're probably looking for ways to improve. So while I said on average you might find 3 to 5% gravity points difference when you sparge, a lot of people report not seeing any difference at all. So play around with this and dial it in for your system. The only caveat here is making sure your mash tun can handle a full boil volume of water plus the grain. All right, so moving on to the next one, we're going to add another 15 minutes of time savings, bringing you up to about an hour, reduced in your brew day. I don't know why I haven't tried this before. This makes a lot of sense. Try using a brew in a bag in your mash tun, even if you're not a brew in a bag brewer. So if you combine this method, using a brew in a bag with the no sparge method, you may not even need to tweak your numbers at all for that no sparge method because you're getting an extra 5% efficiency from the brew in a bag crush. So some of the benefits here, you can mill finer, you get that 5% increase of efficiency, and there's a lot less cleanup time. You're pretty much just lifting the bag out of the wort, squeezing it, and then disposing of your grain however you normally do. And then you just need to spray out your mash tun and spray out the bag. Hold on, you say, you can't squeeze a brew in a bag, that'll release tannins. This is simply untrue. Tannin extraction is a function of pH, temperature, and time. It has nothing to do with squeezing the bag. If you don't know, tannins are that bitter, astringent quality you might get from brewing a tea for too long. But again, it's not a concern here, so don't worry about it. As long as your pH is in check and within normal mashing range, you should be fine. So there's one more benefit to this method, and that's that you're not going to get a stuck mash, despite milling down to almost a powder. And anyone who's experienced a stuck mash will tell you it is terrible. It can add an hour or more to your brew day, and it's just not a fun time. Now, and I like this one a lot. So we're gonna reduce your brew day by another 30 to 45 minutes, bringing your time savings to an hour and a half to an hour and 45 minutes. And we're gonna do that by decreasing the mash time. Assuming you usually do a 60-minute mash, you can count on cutting that in half. For a long time now, there's been discussion on whether we really need a 60-minute mash for conversion. And the consensus seems to be that with a couple caveats that we'll cover in a moment, most of the extraction occurs in the first 10 to 20 minutes of the mash. So why are we spending all this extra time when we don't need to? So if you're interested in this, here's where you should start. First, you want to keep your mash temperature in the optimal zone for the enzymes you're trying to leverage. If you're going for a drier beer, you would want to leverage beta amylase more than alpha amylase. And that's because they cleave starches very predictably, and they cut them into short chains and convert them into short chain sugars. This means your yeast will have an easier time fermenting them, resulting in a drier beer. The optimal range for this enzyme is 144 degrees Fahrenheit to 149 degrees Fahrenheit. So aim for the middle of that if you want to maximize the effects of this enzyme. On the other hand, if you're going for a fuller beer, you want to leverage alpha amylase. And you can do that by staying in the range of 154 to 158 degrees Fahrenheit. The reason this works is alpha amylase is less predictable than beta amylase, and it will randomly cleave those starch chains, resulting in some long chains that are not very fermentable, like dextrins, and some medium and some short chains. So the sugars that are not very fermentable, those are the ones that you can count on to add sweetness, body, fuller mouthfeel to your beer. It's worth mentioning both enzymes will be working in either of these temperature ranges. It is not an on-off switch. It is more like a spectrum, a gradient. So for instance, if you're mashing at 144 degrees Fahrenheit for beta amylase activity, you're also going to get some alpha amylase activity, but not nearly as much as you would if you were mashing higher, around 158 degrees Fahrenheit. And the inverse is true for beta amylase. But wait, you say, I've mashed for 90 minutes and I still didn't get full conversion. How can I mash for 15 to 20 minutes and expect to get anywhere close to my numbers? Well, the answer lies in crush. Crush is everything. We are aiming for a brew in a bag type crush, which is a Nair powder crush. We're talking very fine. And your local homebrew shop crush probably won't cut it here. To get close, you could probably run it through the homebrew shop's mill 2 or 3 times. But I would recommend getting your own mill, such as the Whole Wrecker, which I'll have a link to in the description. It's very similar to the one I use, which isn't available anymore. So this is the closest thing I can recommend. You'll see an efficiency increase as well when you use your own mill, because you can dial it into your system. So at minimum, we're already saving an hour and a half on our brew day. Let's take it further, because we got a lot more to talk about. And you might think this one goes without saying, but it makes a very big impact on your brew day process and flow. It can reduce time and stress throughout the whole brew day. I'm talking, of course, about preparing and planning as much as possible ahead of time. So the night before, you're gonna wanna go through a few checklist items. Triple check your recipe, mill your grains, make sure your yeast is ready to go, lay out all your tools, and even prepare your water ahead of time. The only thing I would recommend here is storing your milled grains in an airtight container to reduce oxidation, which does have an impact on malt flavor and flavor stability. You do not want to oxidize it. The same goes for hops. I always weigh my hops out the day of brewing. I don't want them sitting out all night oxidizing. Hops are also the reason why beer gets light struck and develops a skunky flavor. So you don't want to expose these to any sunlight before you're actually brewing with them. So I usually do everything the night before, like salts, water, grain, all of that stuff, and make sure my physical process is all set up to go, so I can just mash in the morning. So speaking of getting water ready the night before, if you have a G70, a G40, a G30 from Grandfather or a similar system, this is going to be a piece of cake for you. If you have a different system, you might want to invest in a smart switch that can handle the current and wattage of your heating element. That is Wi-Fi controllable, and I'll explain why. So what I do is I fill my mash tun, my G70, with all my water the night before, and then I set a timer. So then in the morning, it automatically starts heating just before I wake up. I then shower, have breakfast, get coffee, all of that sort of stuff. And by the time I'm ready to brew, I can just stir in my salts, mash in, check my pH, and be done with it. This is all really helpful information if you have a family or any other time commitment that might interfere with your brew day. Now, if you're not comfortable with the auto timer, which is totally fine, you could always wake up and just hit start heating on your phone. Or if you have the smart switch, just turn on the switch. Next, and this is something that I neglected for a long time, but since I paid attention to it, it has made me a better brewer, reduced stress, and freed up time during the brew day. Hone your process flow, and I mean that in a physical sense. So when you brew, you typically follow a process of milling your grain, weighing your hops, and other ingredients, of course. So make all this work efficiently for you by keeping a notebook nearby in your brewery and write down any of the major pain points you experience, and then aim to resolve those before the next brew day. I promise this is going to make your life so much easier. You can think of your physical process like a factory flow. You typically want one process to end where the next will start. For instance, I would recommend keeping your grain near where you would weigh it and then mill it. Or another example, you'd want your pH meter, acid, and syringes for dosing that acid all close together, which just makes sense logistically. For me personally, this was installing a reverse osmosis system right next to my G70, so I could just start filling it, walk away, and come back. No more lugging water around the house. So lastly, bringing us to a total of 2 to 3 hours off of our brew day. And this is another controversial one. Shorten your boil time by up to 30 minutes. There are some people who are going to fight this idea, and they're going to say, no, there are reasons why we need a 60-minute boil. So here's some reasons why we don't need a 60-minute boil. Now, historically, we've heard that hop isomerization, which is just bitterness coming from hops, the conversion that happens in the boil, is optimal with 60 minutes. But that doesn't mean we can't just use a larger amount of hops at 30 minutes to achieve a similar result. There are a few reasons I would not go below the 30-minute boil mark, which we'll talk about too. One of which is if you're going for something significantly bitter, you really do want that optimal isomerization. So you're going to want a 60-minute addition for something like an IPA. The next reason people claim a 60-minute boil is required is dissolved oxygen. They will claim that dissolved oxygen is completely scrubbed through a 60-minute boil, and they're not totally wrong. However, the majority of this dissolved oxygen is actually scrubbed out within the first 5 to 10 minutes of boiling. So do we really need 60 minutes? Besides, the yeast is going to take up all that dissolved oxygen for reproductive purposes anyways. Another reason is hot break formation. Hot break is just coagulated proteins, and this will result in clearer beer, less haze, and better flavor stability. Now, hot break formation really only needs about 30 minutes of a boil. This is the other reason why we don't want to go below 30 minutes. In other words, the proteins just need a chance to coagulate and collect together before we chill, so that way you get the benefits from it. So next, DMS reduction was historically a big problem. But nowadays, with modified malts and the concept of a DMS rest, we really don't need more than a 30-minute boil once again. This 30-minute boil should be enough to volatilize and drive off any DMS in the solution. Now, if you don't know what a DMS rest is, I highly recommend checking out my last video, 5 Mistakes You Don't Want to Make, where I go over this concept and how to put it into practice in your brewery. It's an absolute game changer. And I'll make sure there's a link to that in the description as well. And the final reason is sterilization. We boil to kill off any microorganisms that might be harbored in the wort or the water or any of the ingredients we use. Again, 30 minutes is more than enough time to boil and kill these microorganisms. So there you have it. Just took 2 to 3 hours off your brew day. And please don't forget to subscribe if you found this helpful. It helps me to know what content you guys like, and I'll make more of it. And I love the comments, guys. So let us know what time-saving tips work for you. With the tips we talked about today in your toolbox, we're talking about taking a 5 to 7 hour brew day down to 3 to 5 hours. So now you have time to brew more. See you in the next one, and never stop learning.